Rabbi.
Shabbat shalom, Evelyn.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Like many of you, I have tried to find the silver linings around this most challenging pandemic. And of course, that has not been easy. But one nice thing is been having my children home now. Sharing meals this week on Shavuot was a nice treat, although the conversation about Israel was not always easy. We took different points of view, and in my family, there was some passion about each perspective. Now more than ever, we are seeing disagreements within the Jewish community about the current conflict, which thankfully reached a ceasefire yesterday. More and more voices, especially Jewish ones, have spoken out forcefully against Israel and its self-defense tactics, which included painful decisions to bomb places where Hamas stores its weapons and rocket launchers, many of which are in civilian areas, including homes, offices, and even the building that housed journalists like the AP. Although Israel worked hard to warn civilians to get out of harm's way, tragically, some were killed. And the rockets have come down on Israel as Iran pays Hamas to do its bidding. Israel is often caught between a rock and a hard place in terms of how to respond. Even though Hamas, a terrorist organization, has deliberately targeted civilians, the fact that more Palestinians were killed meant to some that Israel had to be in the wrong. And celebrities like Trevor Noah and John Oliver went on the attack, saying whoever is more powerful must be the aggressor. This led many politicians, organizations, and Jews, especially our younger generations, to challenge Israel in ways we have not seen before. On social media, Israel was clearly the object of ire, and the numbers against Israel were overwhelming. It should be noted that there were some voices who stood up for Israel amidst this growing tide. This hate and vitriol took to the streets around the world, where Jews and synagogues were attacked. A smoke bomb and fireworks hurled at Israel supporters near Times Square, and an attack on Jews sitting at a kosher restaurant in Los Angeles. This rise in anti-Semitism is most disturbing. Even more consequential than this, and the entire conflict between Hamas and Israel itself, is the deterioration in the relationship between Israeli citizens, the Jewish ones, especially extremists on the far right, but really more and more of the population, and Palestinian Arabs on the other side, especially their more extreme elements. Both of these groups are citizens of Israel. Non-Jewish Palestinian Arab citizens now make up over 20% of the population of Israel. And while they enjoy more rights in Israel than in the surrounding Arab nations, there is discrimination and the hurtful nation state law that was passed in 2018, which further excluded them. As Yossi Klein Halevi thoughtfully wrote in a New York Times opinion piece this week, this Israeli Arab Palestinian group is not treated equally, and this is a major problem. Israel should be a Jewish state with a unique role for Jews, serving to protect them as the only Jewish homeland. But it must also not lose its responsibility to be a democracy, treating all of its citizens equally. The fighting between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews was particularly violent and disturbing. Mixed towns where Jews and Arabs have lived together suddenly were battlegrounds, with mobs on both sides beating people up, burning cars, attacking homes, even burning down 5 synagogues. Suddenly, it was dangerous to leave one's home, and this spread to other towns and cities. Even our sister city, Haifa, the crown jewel of Jewish-Arab cooperation. This is a most sad and upsetting development. When I feel a bit lost at heart, I turn to the tradition, and sure enough, I find refuge and hope in our texts. In the 9th chapter of Masechet Brachot, the section of the Talmud that focuses on prayer and spirituality, we find a mysterious and striking passage. Rabbi Hanan said that there are 3 things, 3 kinds of dreams, and 3 elements in those dreams which signify peace. And then he says, one is a dream about a river, one is a dream about a bird, and one is a dream about a pot. Now, while the Talmud goes on to substantiate these ideas with verses from the prophet Isaiah, it does not really explain why these 3 items would lead to peace. The Ketav Sofer, Rabbi Abraham Samuel Benjamin Wolf, the oldest son of the 19th century Rabbi Moses Sofer, he looks at these items and then plays a little bit with the order, claiming that a person who sees a pot in her dreams should anticipate peace. If he sees a river, he should anticipate peace. And if they see a bird, they should anticipate peace. He then suggests that there are 3 types of peace in the world, commencing with the most narrow and moving to the wider circles around us. The pot symbolizes cooking, the hearth, and the home. The river signifies a country, as one can travel the length of a river. Often it would normally take you across a specific territory. And finally, the bird can fly over borders from one land to another. Applying this to the current situation in which we find ourselves, we can find the hope for peace in all the current conflicts that I spoke about. We need to improve our home, the family of the Jewish people. Jews should realize that we are one people, and although we may hold different political opinions, we must stress what unifies us over what divides us, especially now as anti-Semitism is on the rise around the world, with attacks this week on Jews across our own country. We must come together. Second, there is the conflict within Israel. This is a time for Israeli Arabs and Jews to stop attacks on each other, reconcile, and find ways to work together. Last fall, we were visited by Mohammed Darwasha, an Israeli Arab leader who directs Givat Chaviva, the Center for a Shared Society. They aim to build an inclusive, socially cohesive society in Israel by engaging divided communities in collective action towards the advancement of a sustainable, thriving Israeli democracy based on mutual responsibility, civic equality, and a shared vision of the future. There needs to be straight talk about the pain and hurt that each side feels, and real listening. After Shabbat, I'll invite you to watch a powerful video about this that I will share. As Yossi Klein Halevi wrote, we avoid the hard questions that threaten our certainties, our insistence on the absolute justice of our side. What is it like to be a Palestinian citizen of a Jewish state that occupies your family? What is it like to be a Jew who has finally come home only to live under constant siege? The current violence wasn't triggered by any one event, but in part by our inability to ask those questions. Perhaps we can begin building a better Israel from that place of shared brokenness. And finally, we need a peace with Gaza. We need only birds to cross the border, not rockets. This is no simple task, but the beginning is to incentivize peace by making rebuilding and its funding dependent on Hamas giving up its arsenal of weapons and its terror activities. This will need a most complicated rapprochement that will hopefully weaken Hamas or somehow transform it into a government that is more focused on nation building, caring for its citizens, and an end to its endless struggle to destroy Israel. It may also need the end to Iranian support. The move to peace is never easy, but it is the goal, as we see in this week's Torah portion, which contains the threefold priestly benediction, which Abby just read. It builds from kindness and turning God's countenance upon us to shalom, to peace, where it ends. The ultimate goal in all our relationships, from the pot to the river to the birds, is peace, shalom. Perhaps the best place to start is to listen to one another more. Deep listening includes the challenging task of listening to opposing views and divergent experiences. But this can transform relationships. That's why the Shema begins with listening, Shema Yisrael, before it teaches us to love, the Ahavta. The opening word invites us to really listen, and then we can infuse love into all the layers of our connections, from our people to building a shared society to peace across borders. In this most difficult time, we need listening and love. Shabbat Shalom.